But here's how the war began. This was really the first images we saw of war on Iraq, and this is Baghdad. This is shock and awe. It was celebrated by as part of the beginning of the debathification campaign, because these were attacks on Iraqi government buildings. It's as if a foreign army blew up the Department of Treasury, they blew up the Department of Defense, they blew up the Department of Agriculture, they blew up the Department of Education. And they thought that the Iraqi people were going to celebrate having their government blown up by a foreign neo-colonial army. Now, when shock and awe took place, I was outside at the Westwood Federal Building. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and I was protesting. I protested from the first day. I also protested Bush's election with a very tiny group of people in Los Angeles because it was a stolen election. So I guess I was one of the original election deniers. When 9/11 happened, it was just straight up stolen. When 9/11 took place, I knew that the US was going to go in and have a phony war with some Arab state. It all just seemed completely obvious to me. But many of the Democrats I knew supported it when it first began. And then they sort of parted ways with Bush as the war started to go south and American soldiers were killed and the insurgency began, as was completely predictable. And it turned out that he lied about WMD and that, but it was all obvious from the beginning that this was going to take place. It was going to be a disaster. And I protested along with a small group of people outside the Westwood Federal Building. I remember a line of sheriffs, LA County sheriffs drove by us. There were also many police who had infiltrated the crowd. There were these big, burly, roided up guys with crew cuts holding answer anti-war signs in the corner. And a woman held up a sign that said, "Law is not war." And a cop looked at it, the lieutenant, and he gave her a thumbs up. And it suggested to me that there was going to be more anti-war opposition in the country than I think the elites and the media elite understood. But for me, the war in Iraq was seminal. It transformed me. It sent me on this journey eventually in journalism, which I think was delayed by the fact that Bush era liberalism meant opposition to the Iraq war, and that liberal NGOs like Move On, which we now understand is just like phony Blue Anon groups, were turning out the Democratic masses to these huge anti-war rallies. And so I was under the belief that that there was a wing of the Democratic Party, or that the Democratic base was anti-war. And then when Obama came in, we saw that that was just simply not the case. He co-opted and destroyed whatever was left of the anti-war movement. But that was my entree into anti-war politics, and also into having contact with people who were organizing Palestine solidarity actions, challenging my concept of liberal Zionism being the right way to engage with Israel. We'll talk about that in a second. But Aaron, reflecting back on the Iraq war, how did it impact you as a journalist?
By the way, in terms of the Democratic Party and the space for anti-war dissent, then I'm pretty sure Nancy Pelosi voted against the Iraq war, right? Back then?
She did,
right? So imagine Nancy Pelosi, who's now in complete lockstep with neocons. Back then, she allowed herself to be anti-war. And that speaks to what you're talking about. That was a time when the Democratic Party gave the illusion of having space for not just people like Dennis Kucinich, but even people like Nancy Pelosi coming out against the Iraq war. Imagine Nancy Pelosi voting against a war now. All she does is promote them. But in terms of how this impacted me as a journalist, I was living in Montreal at the time, so I wasn't as wrapped up in the U.S. media. But I just remember watching with awe, as is the entire U.S. media, except for a few places like Democracy Now!, were in lockstep with what the Bush administration was saying. And there was no, you could read the reporting, you could see how bad it was, and you could see the feedback loop of U.S. officials leaking something to the Times and then citing the Times or the Post as evidence for why we had to go to war in Iraq. And of course, the complete servitude of Tony Blair and what a scam British liberalism showed itself to be, because Labor under Tony Blair totally went along with Bush. And so, yeah, in terms of impacting me, I just remember thinking that the kind of journalism that was, on display back then was not the kind of journalism I wanted to do. And I saw the consequences. I mean, I remember when Phil Donahue was fired because he was allowing critics of the war to come on. And that was a good window into how the U.S. media really works, is they don't allow space for genuine dissent. And so obviously that was a very formative time for me. And, it was incredible that the Bush administration was able to get away with that case when it was just such an obvious scam.
Yeah, and at the time, you did see eventually some opposition to the war in the New York Times editorial pages from the likes of Paul Krugman, who is now he became like the biggest Russiagate stooge and blue anon conspiracist. But at the time, there was some opposition. But for me, it was an opportunity to see how the media sold the public on a war using an intelligence deception that was spun out by defectors and by the intelligence agencies, and how it was stovepiped through various agencies in the government and then filtered out to the media, and then how these reporters enjoyed relationships behind closed doors with the architects of the war. Judith Miller, of course, takes the fall for all of this, but she wasn't alone.
No.
And she was teamed up, by the way, with Michael Gordon, who's still at the New York Times. But she was the one who was writing these bizarre quasi love letters with Scooter Libby, and really going to the mat to protect her source to the point where she went to prison. Here's Judith Miller today. Actually, I found this video, and I don't think it's really widely known that this video exists, but Judith Miller is still defending what she did during the Iraq War. And what she did was extremely consequential. I mean, but let's just let's just nail down the fact that the New York Times oversaw these stories. The New York Times edited them. They vetted them. They allowed Judith Miller to get away with this. So it's not just Judith Miller, but she's still out there defending her work.
The war in Iraq. It was all me. Okay, it was mostly me. I had some help from a clueless President George W. Bush and his neoconservative puppet master, Vice President Dick Cheney. Senior White House fanatics spoon-fed reporters like me cherry-picked intelligence about Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction so that America could invade Iraq and seize its oil. None of this is true, but many Americans continue to believe it. People died. It was a war. But President Bush didn't lie us into it.
It's just a war.
The false narrative that he did is itself a lie and deserves to be at last retired.
Okay, so she goes on for another 5 minutes at PragerU.
Unbelievable.
It's shocking. And it's shocking that she's still out there. She says the big lie is that Bush lied.
That's just mind-blowing.
And I mean, there are people who still believe this. Like Liz Cheney teamed up with her father not long ago on a piece arguing that Saddam Hussein was in league with Al-Qaeda, in fact, and may have had WMD. We still see this thrown around. David Frum recently wrote, war criminal David Frum. He recently wrote that aside from Iraq's chemical weapons that could be fired by artillery shells, the WMD just weren't there. So he's basically saying there were WMD, and that wasn't there.
And what's their narrative? It's always, we meant to do good, but we just didn't realize how broken Iraqi society was that couldn't handle our noble efforts to spread democracy and freedom. So we didn't properly factor in how Iraq was too primitive for our democracy promotion. That's basically the message from people like David Frum. By the way, interesting story about the whole chemical weapons allegation against Iraq. A former guest on the Grayzone on my show Pushback, Jose Bustani, he was the head of the OPCW at the time, and he was trying to prevent the U.S. invasion. So he offered to Iraq, why don't you come into the chemical weapons convention and that will subject you to regular inspections. And if you indeed have no chemical weapons, then that will undermine the case for war. And Iraq said, great. And they tried to sign on. John Bolton got word of that, went over to Bustani's office, said to him, we know where your kids live, and you have to back down on this. And if you don't, you have to resign. And Bustani said, I'm not going to resign. And that's when John Bolton said, we know where your kids live. And then when Bustani still wouldn't back down, Bolton basically bullied enough member states to vote out Bustani, even though they had just renewed his tenure for a 5-year term. So the Bush administration was so determined to spread its lies that Iraq had chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction that they engineered the ouster of a senior diplomat who was standing in the way, because he was trying to bring Iraq into the Chemical Weapons Convention where they could undergo regular inspections. And Bustani, also has a connection to the OPCW whistleblower story, because the OPCW whistleblowers who blew the whistle on a cover-up in Syria, they're so experienced that they were working at the OPCW back at the time when Bustani was being ousted. So he's come up and spoken in their defense. So it's just interesting how this comes full circle. And the fact that they went so far as to oust the head of the OPCW just to push their Iraq war lies, it speaks to what a joke it is to claim that, as Judith Miller does, that really the Bush administration didn't lie at all. That's wow. I'm speechless at that.
Was David Kay? What happened with David Kay in the UK? George Galloway's film on David Kay deserves consideration. He argues that he was actually murdered because
and he was a weapons inspector.
Well, he was the chief weapons investigator for Tony Blair, who was pushing the government's line until he realized it was a giant lie. Then he just goes off in the woods and blows his brains out.
Okay, it was a different name.
David Kelly. I'm sorry, David Kelly.
Yeah. There was a David Kay who was a weapons inspector, but he passed away recently. But yeah, so
okay, my apologies to the family of David.
Let's get the name right. So it was David Kelly.
David Kelly. He was a scientist, an authority on biological warfare.
There you go.
He was working at Porton Down, which is the place that also analyzed the Skripal poisoning, and it's right there in Salisbury.
Yep.
So lots of intrigue, and David Kelly was said to have committed suicide July 17th, 2003, as the reality that Tony Blair and his team had completely lied to the British public about the case for war with Iraq was coming to light. And David Kelly, well, I really would recommend watching George Galloway's film.
I haven't seen it. I got to watch it. I'm just learning now, just looking this up as you're talking about it. That
called Killing Kelly.
The day before Kelly died, he testified to the UK Parliament about Iraq WMDs. The day before he supposedly killed himself. Well, I'll definitely watch this movie, Killing Kelly.
Yeah, I mean, we have Daily Mail actually entertaining evidence that David Kelly didn't commit suicide. Official explanation was that the weapons expert had taken his own life, but since Kelly's death, time has done nothing to dispel suspicion. Successive governments have refused to allow full coroner's inquest to be held. We have Hans Blix, who is also one of the key weapons inspectors, calling recently for Bush and Blair to be tried before the International Criminal Court. And I just want to make, because I know you have to go soon, and I want to get through one more quick segment. One point about the importance of the Iraq War for me. For 1 million Iraqis, it meant their death. For thousands of Americans, it meant their death in vain in a criminal war. For thousands more, it meant their lives were ruined. For their families, it meant their lives were ruined. It destabilized the region. It gave rise to ISIS. But for me, it educated me on what regime change really is. It is always fundamentally evil, and it will always fail. And the United States will always seek to destroy the entire state structure and destabilize a country, because it doesn't actually seek the success of a country after regime change. It's all about destabilization and turning these countries into despotic netherworlds, because on a fundamental level, if there is a strong Iraqi central government that unites all the sects, it is going to participate in a multipolar world, and it is not going to be in its interest to be fully aligned with the US, and it is going to challenge the presence of Israel. So the lesson there also is that WMD was not a one-off lie that the American public was sold on. It was the blueprint for every regime change operation. Libya had the lie about Viagra being given to Libyan soldiers, about the fake massacre Gaddafi was going to commit in Benghazi, then the Syrian chemical attacks, which you've exposed, Aaron. That's Iraqi WMD. And Judith Miller, she's not some outlier. She's not a bad apple, as Abu Ghraib torturer Lindy England was said to be. She is the standard for the US national security reporter. All they do is take controlled leaks and stenography for the US intelligence services to sell these regime change wars to the American public. There are 1,000 Judith Millers running around in Washington, and then there are many more in the think tanks and on the staff of every member of Congress. This is the Iraq and George W. Bush himself. At the time, I feel like he's like this radical Texas cowboy Republican who wants to destroy the legacy of his dad. Yeah, there's who because his dad didn't go all the way. Yeah, there was an element of that, but Obama was really no different when it came to regime change wars. Nor is Joe Biden. I mean, they just
learned.
By the way,
yeah, they just learned that they can't send in so many U.S. troops, and because they're going to lose the American public if people start coming home in body bags. So they really went into proxy wars in Syria and Libya. I mean, Syria in Libya, there was an air bombing, but in terms of the ground force, that was basically supporting an Al-Qaeda infused insurgency on the ground. And of course, same with Syria too, an Al-Qaeda dominated insurgency.
Yeah. I mean, yes. So proxy wars are necessary for the U.S. or preferable for the U.S. because they eliminate the possibility of domestic political repercussions. As we see, the Rage Against the War Machine rally or the rally coming up this weekend would be much, much bigger. I mean, by a factor of 100 if American soldiers were actually coming back in body bags. But the goal is the same: destruction and destabilization of all U.S. challengers, all independent countries. This is the Wolfowitz Doctrine. The Wolfowitz Doctrine is the blueprint. And it's why we see Victoria Nuland having so much control over the Biden administration's policy toward Ukraine and China to a certain extent. Who is she? The wife of Robert Kagan, who wrote the blueprint for the Neoconservatives, the Project for a New American Centuries plan for a benevolent empire. In other words, total U.S. control. It was basically an articulation of the Wolfowitz Doctrine for the neoconservative bipartisan intelligentsia, and it is now the official doctrine, I would say, of the Democratic Party and its foreign policy wing, including self-styled progressives like Matt Duss or Ro Khanna.
The neocons won. They can look back on this anniversary of the Iraq War, which should have destroyed them as a political entity for good. Instead, they've only gotten stronger. It's an incredible political achievement on their part. The fact that faction could preside over the Iraq War, the crime of the century, a huge disaster, and come out stronger 20 years later and actually enlist all the same forces that used to go out in the street and protest them in the Democratic Party. That's an amazing political achievement on their part. Yeah.
And, in the Bush era, they were hamstrung by Bush being a kind of Christian conservative who ran in 2004 on blocking the legalization of gay marriage. Now, neoconservatism is articulated through the progressive prism of the culture war.
Yeah.
And so we are liberating women and minorities, and Ukraine is said to be a pro-gay war or pro-gay army. They've taken the pinkwashing of the Israeli army. So neoconservatism has really demonstrated its resiliency. But as I said at the Rage Against the War Machine rally, if we don't fight the neocons over here, they will continue to kill millions more over there. So we can't stop fighting them. Wherever they are the main enemy. Whatever party they're in, they're the enemy. The Iraq War demonstrated that. The Libyan War, the Syrian dirty war, Ukraine, these are neoconservative projects. And Americans need to understand what neoconservatism is and understand that it is a more threatening and dangerous political force than anything else that we're confronted with.